Hello, Ambassadors. Welcome to our fourth lesson in the study of Joseph's trials, called When You're Flat on Your Back, Everything's Looking Up. Today we'll be in Genesis 39. Joseph found himself in a country and culture he didn't know, surrounded by a language he didn't understand. This once longed-for child of Rachel and openly favored son of Jacob had been sold as a common slave and forced into a situation that seemed even worse than the pit into which his brothers had initially thrown him. As we're introduced to his circumstances in Egypt, notice that two things are conspicuous by their absence. First, there is no mention of time. We have no indication of how long Joseph has been in Potiphar's house when these events began to unfold. He could have been there for 2 years or 2 months. Second, nothing is said about the adjustments that Joseph had to make. Remember, he'd come from a rural culture, an unsophisticated people, and a home where he had been the pride and joy of his mother and the favorite child of a doting, aging father. Without warning, he was grabbed roughly by his brothers, stripped of his beautiful robe, and dumped into a deep, dirty pit. He was rescued from that situation, only to be sold to hardened slave traders and taken overland by caravan to a distant land where he was set on the block and sold like a cheap piece of merchandise. The changes and adjustments that he faced must have been phenomenal. We read in the Genesis account that he was sold to a man named Potiphar, who is described as the captain of the bodyguard, or as the New International Version translates it, the captain of the guard. This group was an elite, courageous band of rugged men. The Jewish historian Alfred Edersheim describes that group by telling us that Potiphar was the chief of the executioners. No matter what title you give him, Potiphar was nobody to fool around with. He was a man of seasoned military experience with power over life and death. Yet Joseph not only adjusted to his new situation, but flourished in it, and for one major reason. That reason emerges in a beautiful phrase that appears a number of times in Joseph's story. The Lord was with Joseph. I wish we were together so we could discuss the questions in groups, but since we can't, I suggest that you pause after each question and think about your answer before resuming listening to the lesson. In Genesis 39, what do we learn about dealing with temptation from this chapter? There's not a person who has cast his shadow across the earth, including Jesus Christ, who has not faced temptation. The Hebrew writer says of Jesus, "We do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way just as we are, yet he did not sin." And in chapter 2, verse 18, he says, "Because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he's able to help those who are being tempted." And there's not a single person who's ever lived except Christ who has not yielded to it at one time or another and suffered the consequences. Temptation is an inevitable part of our fallen world. We cannot escape it. Just say no. Well, that's a familiar echo on the war on drugs, but it's really done very little to reduce narcotic use. It doesn't work with sexual temptation either. God warns you in the Scriptures that you cannot handle sexual temptation with mere determination or self-discipline. Rather, He provides two clear principles of defense against sensual onslaught. The first principle is preventative. Express daily devotion to Jesus Christ. You cannot simply say no. That leaves a vacuum. You recall that Jesus told a story about how those vacuums end? In Luke 11, He said this, verse 24, "When an impure spirit comes out of a person, it goes through arid places, seeking rest, and does not find it. Then it says, 'I will return to the house I left.' When it arrives, it finds the house swept clean and put in order. Then it goes and takes 7 other spirits more wicked than itself, and they go in and live there. And the final condition of that person is worse than the first." For the Christian, what happens is, if we create a void by simply saying no to temptation and we don't fill it with the affirmative yes to Jesus Christ, we'll fall back into sin once again. We have to take that no and add to it a yes to Jesus Christ. Yes, Lord, I do love you. I want to follow you. I do realize my frailty, and I ask you to deliver me from temptation. I'm committed to you. This everyday exercise takes up the shield of faith and withstand Satan's ploys. The second principle is simple. Flee temptation and avoid the source. That's what Joseph did, and you and I have to do the same thing. Don't go out to lunch with your secretary. Don't meet your boss for a late-night meeting. Don't visit a local hangout. Paul said it well. Clothe yourself with the presence of the Lord Jesus Christ, and don't let yourself think about ways to indulge your evil desires. Joseph loved God too much to sin against him, and so he fled at the peak of temptation. Both principles still work. Today's chapter deals with sexual temptation. What other temptations come our way? Well, temptation wears many faces. There is, for example, material temptation, which is the lust for things. It might be as big as a house or as small as a ring. It might be bright and dazzling as a brand new Porsche or as dull and dusty as an antique roll-top desk. Yet who hasn't felt the burning passion of lust for things? And who hasn't at times yielded to it unwisely? Then there's what we call personal temptation, which is the lust for fame, for authority, for power, for control over others. It might be as simple as lust for a title like CEO or president or doctor or professor or admiral. There's nothing wrong with those titles or those positions until lust comes and says, you deserve that for what it will mean to you. Finally, there's sensual temptation, which is lust for another person, or in reality, lust for the person's body. I'm referring here to the hedonistic desire to have and enjoy that which is not one's own, either legally or morally. In 1 John 2:16, the Message translation reads it this way: practically everything that goes on in the world, wanting your own way, wanting everything for yourself, wanting to appear important, has nothing to do with the Father. It just isolates you from Him. If you were casting Joseph in a movie, who would you choose to play the role? Well, I read that John Legend is the sexiest man alive, so maybe you'd want to pick someone like him. Joseph was at the pinnacle in Potiphar's penthouse estate. There was no doubt that God was with him, and he was handsome, extraordinarily handsome. The NIV says in Genesis 39:6, Joseph was well built and handsome. The Message reads it this way: Joseph was a strikingly handsome man. It was the genes. The same phrase is used of his lovely mother Rachel in Genesis 29:17, when the text says Rachel had a lovely figure and it was beautiful. And they're the only two people in Scripture to receive this double accolade: Rachel and her son Joseph. The Jewish Publication Society translation, like the NIV, reads, Joseph was well built and handsome. What a magnificent spectacle he was in his Egyptian kilt, tan, broad-shouldered, slim waist, great abs. And it was here that the story turned, because with all of his gifts, Joseph suffered from one endowment too many. What rationalizations might Joseph have used to justify going to bed with Potiphar's wife? Well, that was an insidious temptation. Joseph was 17 or 18 years old, right at his sexual peak. His hormones were at full force, so he brimmed with sexual curiosity and drive. And the rationalizations were so easy and logical. He could say to himself, no one will ever know. His family certainly wouldn't find out. I mean, after all, they were on the other side of Sinai. He might say, well, I'm a slave, and my life is not my own. And in reality, in his world, sexual promiscuity was a daily part of all slaveholding households. Besides, by giving in to Ms. Potiphar wishes, he could enhance his career. This is a time-honored political strategy. What's so wrong with a little strategic adultery if it furthers the cause? And face it, old Potiphar was gone all the time. He was not meeting his wife's needs. She was entitled to a little caring affection, and so this would actually be the loving thing to do. In today's terms, the situation would almost demand this kind of a response. Even more, who could blame him? It was in his blood. Just look at his brothers. Reuben slept with one of his father's wives, and Judah slept with his daughter-in-law thinking she was a prostitute. And again, who's going to know? Think back to Joseph's background. How might that have contributed to this temptation? Those are powerful, reasonable rationalizations. And as Andrew Schmulzer explains, Joseph knew the dysfunction of a father's favoritism, the scorn of 10 brothers' hatred, the betrayal of being sold for profit by those responsible for him, the disdain of a slave's life as someone else's property, and the isolation of being transplanted to a foreign soil and culture. With this as his bio, Joseph had every reason to be angry, bitter, resentful, cynical, fearful, self-serving, and self-pitying. Joseph had every human reason to find fleeting solace in an illicit embrace, frankly, to act out. Who could blame that kind of victim? Genesis 39, 8-10. How many reasons did Joseph have to not go to bed with Potiphar's wife? Count them. Joseph resisted temptation because he had a list. He gave her 5 reasons for refusal. He said, "With me in charge, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house." That's 1. "Everything he owns, he's entrusted to my care." That's 2. "No one is greater in this house than I am." That's 3. "My master has withheld nothing from me except you because you're his wife." That's 4. And number 5 is, "How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And so, even though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. Joseph resisted temptation because he had not 1 reason but 5. He had a list. And with a list, you can keep yourself motivated to stay the course. Genesis 39:9. How did Joseph's vertical relationship with God help him deal with this temptation? In short, Joseph refused to sin against the trust given to him, the woman's husband, and God himself. Joseph was a man of integrity, and because he was faithful in all his relationships, he could resist being unfaithful in this one instance. You see, the story is not just about sexual fidelity. Joseph's life was a web of moral accountability. He saw his moral life as a unified, integrated whole. His overall faithfulness had helped him reject this massive temptation. We must understand that little sins pave the way to big sins, and that Joseph was on no such path. It was the power of this quality of his life as a whole that enabled him to resist the woman's advances. Of course, the greatest deterrent to falling to the sexual siege was Joseph's awareness that God was with him, not because of the narrator's voiceover, but because this is what God had repeatedly promised Joseph's forefathers and had been his personal awareness all of his life. The grand deterrent to Joseph's sinning was the awareness that God sees all, and that a sin that no one else knows about, committed behind locked doors in a dark room, is actually done in the presence of a holy God. Joseph believed this, and I'm convinced that the personal realization and conviction of this truth is the strongest deterrent to sin that there is. King David invoked it after the horror of his own sin ravaged his soul. He said in Psalm 51, "I know my transgressions. My sin is ever before me. Against you, you only, have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight." Genesis 39:10. What do we learn about dealing with temptation? Joseph was 28 years old when Potiphar's wife propositioned him. We can calculate that from Genesis 41:1 and 46. He was a single man who had been unjustly sold into slavery at the age of 17 by his brothers. But God was with him as he served Potiphar faithfully for 11 years. Joseph didn't have a wife. As far as we know, he was still a virgin at the age of 28. He certainly had all the same physical desires you and I have. A proposition from Potiphar's wife must have appealed to his flesh. In spite of his physical desires, however, he spoke directly to her and asked how he could do such a wicked thing against God. His rebuke didn't stop her. Genesis 39:10 says, "And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her." Not only did he have to fight off temptation once, he had to do it repeatedly. When she finally caught him alone one day and tried to seduce him by physically grabbing his cloak, he ran out of the house, leaving his cloak in her hand. You know the rest of the story. He was imprisoned because Potiphar's shunned wife accused Joseph of attempting to sleep with her. How did Joseph stay so strong in the midst of continual temptation? Look at the last few words of Genesis 39:10. Or even be with her. He didn't put himself in a position to fall. At first, he avoided her. Eventually, he ran, probably because it was getting more difficult to say no. His three-step approach of refusal, avoidance, and fleeing kept him from falling into sin and from losing the blessings of God on his life. Genesis 39:11. What do we learn about temptation and how to deal with it from this verse? The temptation came during a time of secrecy. The timing of temptation is seen in the last attempt of Potiphar's wife to seduce Joseph. She waited until no one was around, then she attacked, Genesis 39:11. She sought to use the advantage of secrecy to encourage sinful conduct. Many will do in private what they'll never do in public, and the tempter knows this. It's time we woke up to this fact and exercised some due caution. Many pastors, as an example, have failed in this matter because they've unnecessarily allowed themselves to be in private situations in counseling and in calling that have resulted in moral disaster. Those on dates should also be especially cautious about lonely roads and secluded spots. You see, temptation thrives in those places. Avoid them like the plague. When Joseph saw the peril of privacy, he fled, and so should we. Genesis 39:12. Joseph ran. What's the lesson for us? We need to flee from things and places that bring strong temptation. Too many times we feel that we're strong enough to endure and resist a temptation. However, God does not want us to stick out a temptation. He wants us to take the exit He provides. The New Testament gives us instructions to flee from four things. 1 Corinthians 6:18, flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside of the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. 1 Corinthians 10:14, therefore, my dear friends, flee from idolatry. 1 Timothy 6:11, but you, man of God, flee from all of this. And when you look in the context, he's talking about the love of money in verse 10. And pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, and endurance, and gentleness. And 2 Timothy 2:22, flee the evil desires of youth and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace, along with those who call on the Lord out of a pure heart. So four things we're told to flee from in the New Testament: sexual immorality, idolatry, the love of money, and youthful lusts. It's appropriate that this word run is found in the text because the Christian life is, after all, a race. Hebrews 12:1 says as much. So we need to get our running shoes on. We need to run from sin and run toward Christ at the finish line, the one who is the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. Genesis 39:11-20. Joseph ran, and then he lived happily ever. Is that right? What did happen? What's the lesson for us? Once again, a piece of clothing plays a role in Joseph's fate. Earlier, it was that ornate robe that his father had given him that was used as evidence that he'd been mauled by a wild beast. Now Potiphar's wife uses his cloak as evidence that he had tried to rape her. Joseph is just not a lucky man where clothing is concerned. So she frames Joseph. First, she calls the household servants, who must have been nearby. She tells them that she'd screamed when Joseph tried to force himself on her. Notice she doesn't refer to him by name, but she calls him the Hebrew, probably evoking the well-known disdain that the Egyptians had for Asiatics. Potiphar's wife complained to the household servants and to her husband when he finally returned home that Joseph had made sport of her. The verb make sport has sexual connotations, as in Genesis 26:8 when Abimelech saw Isaac caressing his wife Rebekah. The same word is used there. This sexual meaning is likely also at play when we read about the Israelites engaging in revelry at the presence of the golden calf, which is the other place in the Old Testament where this particular word is used. Interestingly, Potiphar's wife recruits the support of the household servants by saying that he was making sport of us, thus including the servants with her. In other words, she's saying by trying to rape her, he was raping all of them. We don't know what Joseph's relationship to all the other household servants was like, but his favored status and his ethnicity may have already engendered a level of jealousy that she's here trying to intensify. Matthew 6:13. Jesus taught us to pray, "Lead us not into temptation." What exactly did he mean by that? When you pray, "Lead us not into temptation," you're establishing a watchful attitude over your spiritual life. This is the same prayer Jesus gave to his disciples in the garden after he found them sleeping. Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Matthew 26:41. When you pray, "Lead us not into temptation," you're asking for deliverance from both a crisis and a process. In referring to temptation, Jesus used the word perosmos, which means that temptation is a process. So when we say, "Lead us not into temptation," what we're saying is, don't put me in the place of seduction where I wrestle with temptation every day. Think about it. When a football team beats its crosstown rival, it doesn't have to beat them every day to be the best team. They schedule one game a year, and the winner's the best team. So when we pray the Lord's Prayer in the face of temptation, we're praying, don't allow us to be continually tempted by a particular sin. When you're flat on your back, everything's looking up. Join me next time for our last lesson in this series of lessons from Joseph's trials.